Okay, well, let's go ahead and get into evaluating impact as our next topic. So I see these things as all kind of interconnected. So good planning and evaluation are all part of evidence-based practice and strategic approaches. So that's what kind of holds these different topics together. So evaluation is about assessing whether we've achieved what we set out to. That's the kind of core focus of evaluation. There are other dimensions and other things that we can focus on. So, for example, evaluation can focus on process as opposed to outcomes, but the kind of core, you know, bread and butter part of evaluation is what's called summative evaluation, and that's assessing whether we've achieved our objectives. So what we talked about yesterday around having clear, explicit, realistic objectives, that's really important when we come to design the evaluation as well. So what I often see as an evaluation consultant is that the impact objectives are framed in too broad of terms. So they're not realistic, they're too vague, too general. And then that issue, that kind of fuzziness conceptually at the level of objectives, ends up affecting the evaluation dimension. So then the evaluation, for example, if it's a survey, those vague objectives turn into vague survey questions that are used for the evaluation. And so the problem just kind of keeps passing along as we make our way through the project. So if you have really specific, clear impact objectives, this makes the evaluation process so much more straightforward and much more likely to work out well. So, I mean, oftentimes my first step as an evaluation consultant is helping the client to refine, improve their impact objectives because we can't really go further. We can't have a good evaluation with a clear design and well-structured data collection if the impact objectives are too vague and broad. So, for example, if it's a public engagement activity, but the objective is reducing health inequalities by 40% in a region, the when I go to write a survey question about that, it's just not possible to design a good survey question at that level because it's not realistically tied to the activity itself. So each of these things that I talked about yesterday around impact planning has a role when we get to evaluation. So theory of change as well also is very helpful for the evaluation because then we can see where are the kind of points in the impact process that we could evaluate. We can never evaluate everything. It's never feasible to look at all the interesting things that we could look at or all the important things. So we always have to prioritize. One way of prioritizing is to say, okay, looking at this theory of change, which parts of this are the weakest? Which parts am I the least confident in because there isn't existing evidence or we don't have past evaluations to support the idea that this is actually going to work as we say? That could be a good point to target for your evaluation. You don't have to focus it that way. It's just one of the options. Okay, so then when we are doing, even when we're doing an impact evaluation, it's important to gather information about participants. So the profile of participants matters. And one of the common mistakes I see in evaluation design for when surveys are used is that the data collected does not allow you to see if there are systematic differences in how people are experiencing an activity, an event, an outcome based on demographic characteristics. So, for example, is there a gender difference in how people are responding to this event? Are people from minority ethnic backgrounds responding to this differently than people from white majority backgrounds? This kind of thing you can only speak to if you collect data about the profile of the participants. So the main point of evaluation is to tell you what's working and why. You need the why because the idea is that this is supposed to be an evidence-based practice, which means just getting like a thumbs up, you've got a great event, doesn't help you make your event any better or your project any better. You need to have some detail about what's working, what's not working. And so it's extremely rare. I can't think of any examples offhand to have an evaluation that I've set up be just purely positive with nothing to learn or improve. That would be problematic if your results from the evaluation just give you green lights all the way along. That means you're not really probing deeply enough to look at what are the patterns, what are the issues, what are the impacts. It's, for example, maybe you're only asking about satisfaction rather than getting at outcomes in that case. So what I see in terms of the mindset for evaluation, the most important characteristic is a willingness to redesign your approach to public engagement or impact development. There should be an openness to that, to the idea that the way you're doing things now is just provisional. It's a best estimate of what's going to work. And then you use incoming evidence from evaluation to refine and improve over time. So that's the correct attitude for science in general. It's also the correct attitude for developing evidence-based public engagement. So good impact evaluation is systematic. It reveals what are the kind of lessons to be learned from this evaluation. So it reveals things that you can improve, that you can do better. One of the distinctions that I often highlight is between these two concepts, advocacy and evaluation. So evaluation is about getting to the bottom of what's working and how your activity, your project can be improved over time. Advocacy is about telling nice, happy, positive stories about how great your activity is. It may be possible to derive some advocacy from an evaluation, but these two goals shouldn't be conflated. They're distinct goals. So the distinction between advocacy and evaluation, basically, if you want, I mean, advocacy is a perfectly realistic and reasonable thing to do. It makes sense in some circumstances. If the goal is advocacy, then you would do things like collecting testimonials, for example. Maybe you'd video record testimonials. So you go about it in a way that's different than an evaluation where you collect survey data, for example, or interview data. So I just mentioned this because sometimes the advocacy goal ends up kind of pushing in to the evaluation data collection, and it kind of pollutes the exercise. The approach to designing a good evaluation involves thinking through the data you're going to collect, how you're going to analyze that data, and what you're going to do with the results. So how is this evaluation going to feed in to your future work? And so sometimes like, for example, if you're doing a one-off program that you're not going to repeat again in the future, it may be of limited value to do a post-program summative evaluation. It might be better to invest your effort at the front end of the process to test, to have like a focus group with people talking about your plans and giving you feedback on the materials you're going to be providing. So something that's early stage may be more appropriate if you're not going to be able to use the results again in a future program from a summative evaluation. So it's important to think about, am I actually going to be able to use the learning from this evaluation? If not, it may not be worth the investment of resources to do the evaluation. Might be better to focus your resources elsewhere. So as I mentioned, the impact objectives, the intended outcomes, these are your kind of starting point when you go to design an evaluation. So you use this as your guiding light, both for the design of the intervention itself, your impact objectives kind of orient your activity that you're going to design, And it also is the starting point for the evaluation, because when we start to do an evaluation, we have to think about what is it that we want to measure. And what is it we want to measure should be answered by those objectives. We should be able to see the objectives and say, okay, I can see there's this outcome that we're going to need to measure. And then that's the kind of jumping off point. So the kinds of questions that you should be able to answer before you go about designing your evaluation, and therefore these are the kind of jumping off point, are how are people supposed to be different because they've gone through this experience? What would they be saying or doing, or how would they be behaving in a different way because they've attended this event or they've gone through this process, that kind of thing. So that all of that doesn't have to be in your one sentence impact objective, but you should be able to answer it straightforwardly. It shouldn't be like those questions shouldn't have you stuck where you can't answer them straightforwardly about how should people be different. So theory of change would be a way to map out to the bigger picture. So the example I showed yesterday. So what you see in turquoise, green at the end on the far right are what we've labeled as actual benefits. So these are the kind of the bigger picture things. They're still fairly clear and explicit and specific, but they're big. They're things that can't be changed through a small, like one activity kind of intervention. So this is kind of showing a structure for getting at that bigger picture where you may not do any data collection in an evaluation at the level of the green boxes. You may only be tracking whether things are developing in the direction that would be necessary to deliver actual benefits ultimately. Okay, so as we transition from impact objectives to the evaluation, we think about what are we actually trying to learn from the evaluation? What do we need to know? So the evaluation question is not exactly just a kind of direct translation of the impact objectives. It involves some kind of strategic thinking about what are we going to do with this information? Does it really make sense for us to evaluate the whole set of objectives that we're trying to achieve with this project, or is there something more specific we should focus on? So you have to apply some judgment when you're shifting from developing your project, your program, to choosing what you're going to evaluate and trying to choose in a way that gets you the most benefit for the least investment, basically, is what you're aiming for. And sometimes feasibility will constrain what you can do for your evaluation. Sometimes what we most want to know is just not realistic to evaluate given the budget. That's a very common constraint. Sometimes if you really wanted to get to the bottom of something, you'd end up eating up 20-30% of the intervention budget to get to it, which only makes sense if it's a prototype. If that's the whole point of that project, is to prototype and pilot and test a new model that then could be rolled out in the future, then having it be 20, 30, 40% of the budget for evaluation is no problem. That's makes sense. But if the point of it is the intervention itself, then the rule of thumb in most contexts is about 10% of the budget would go to evaluation. That's the default assumption, and normally not more than 20%. So that will constrain options, obviously. So there's a range of tools available for collecting data. So here I'm thinking about interventions that are aimed at people. So societal impact most often means that we're going via people, humans, as opposed to biological systems or that kind of thing. So that's what I'm talking about here is human data collection, social data collection. So we have options that are qualitative in nature. That means that we're talking about words or pictures, kind of anything that's not numbers would be qualitative. And then quantitative is obviously numerical data. And then often it can make sense to combine, have a mix of quantitative and qualitative measures. So for qualitative data collection, the kind of main toolkit is surveys that are asking open-ended questions, interviews, observational methods, focus groups, and analysis where you look at what people have produced, for example, and you look at patterns in what they've produced. So the major challenge with qualitative evaluation is that it can be quite intensive on resource requirements. So conducting a qualitative interview, for example, if you do it, really properly, a qualitative interview can be 30 to 60 minutes in length. Then you would be expected to at least partially transcribe it. Now that is getting more and more straightforward to do with automated tools. So the barrier is reducing for doing qualitative evaluation, but you still have to kind of check those. Even if you use automated transcription, you still have to check them over. There will be errors. So you do invest considerable time just in kind of shifting from audio to text. Then you still need to actually do something with that text. Again, things are getting easier. There are options for using generative AI tools, for example, qualitative data analysis. A straightforward qualitative data analysis can be streamlined and supported and made faster with generative AI tools like ChatGPT. But it's still a significant undertaking. Focus groups are a fantastic way of collecting data where you really want a lot of feedback from different perspectives on the same thing. So for example, if you're developing a video, a documentary that you want to roll out to a lot of people, doing a test with a focus group can be a great option. You get a kind of diverse range of feedback on what you've developed, and then you can incorporate the learning and move forward. But it's challenging and time consuming. So the benefits of qualitative approaches are that they are flexible, so you can adapt your approach over time. If you find that, for example, a question that you're asking in an interview isn't really working, or it's not generating interesting, useful responses, you can just adjust it. You can change it the next interview. And that's considered that's a good thing. Whereas if you're doing a survey and you realize halfway through that you chose bad survey questions or you phrase them wrong, you're kind of stuck. You have to maintain exactly the same survey question every single time somebody responds to it. Otherwise, you don't have meaningful data. So the benefit is flexibility, and you can get more in-depth responses from this kind of approach than you could from surveys often. But it's relatively rare. Like most people, most of the time, are using surveys for their evaluations in public engagement. So first, it's worth kind of thinking about the kinds of things that you can learn from a focus group compared to a quantitative method, for example. So in focus groups, in interviews, any kind of qualitative method, the kinds of questions you're asking are, what are the range of experiences or responses that people have had? So what are the patterns? What are the kind of edges, the extent, the range of ways that people answer? Because you should not be making claims about like most people said X or most people thought Y, because that's not the point of doing qualitative evaluations. They're not designed for giving you representative samples of your population or allowing you to make quantitative claims. And then the other thing that they're really good at, the qualitative methods, is getting at sense making. So how are people interpreting and making sense of the public engagement activity? For example, you can walk through the process that people are going through as they're making sense of it, and you can see where things are going wrong, for example, where they're interpreting things in a way that you didn't intend, that kind of thing. One of the critical things which I'll emphasize for both of these methods, I'm going to talk in a little bit of detail about both interviews and focus groups. So in both cases, it's really important to make sure that you're primarily in listening mode. So for the participant, it should feel in an interview, it should feel like a conversation. that just happen to involve them talking 90+% of the time. So it should feel like just a normal, like what the most common comment that I hear from participants after an interview is, "Oh, that was a nice chat, but I don't know how you're going to be able to use that. We were just chit-chatting for an hour. That's it." So from their perspective, it felt smooth enough that it felt like a conversation. Um, that so it should not be like a robotic reading off of questions, like or they, you ask one question, they speak, and then you ask your next question. That's not how interviews should work. They should be much more smooth, especially the semi-structured qualitative interview is the most commonly used approach. And that should involve listening to what they said, asking probing follow-up questions to get more detail, more depth, that kind of thing. Um, and you should not give the impression that you're just reading off questions from a list. So there are three different types of qualitative interview. As I mentioned, semi-structured is the most commonly used for evaluation. That's where you have initial sets of guiding questions, but you follow where people lead you. So you ask probing questions and get more detail. So you maintain a degree of flexibility while making sure that you cover the issues that you plan to over the course of the interview. Structured interviewing is a fixed set of questions, and it's closer to kind of an out loud survey without you still will ask some probing. You could say, like, could you explain more, this kind of thing, but you don't like follow trails off in a different direction. And then unstructured interview is not a good idea to do unless you have a ton of experience doing qualitative interviewing. That's where you go in with just a general sense of the direction you're wanting to probe, and then it's entirely kind of free form follow up. I've got almost 20 years of experience doing qualitative interviews, and I don't do unstructured interviews. So it's a very easy for those to go wrong. So focus groups have a lot of similarities. So the kind of core listening skill where you are trying to draw out people's perspectives, where the participant is speaking the vast majority of the time, that's still the case. So in both of these, you're not giving your opinion as the interviewer or moderator is what you're called in a focus group. You're just kind of absorbing the opinion of your participants. The thing that's different with the focus group is now you have multiple participants, which means they may disagree with each other about some things. And that's interesting and helpful because when there's disagreement, people have to explain. And that's what you really want is the explanations. So the surface level, that was a nice event. That's not what you're after with qualitative methods. You're looking to go deeper than that. What was it that made it a nice event? What was it that, connected or didn't? Like you want to dig as deep as you can with qualitative methods. If you don't do that, there's no point in using these methods. You can more efficiently get the information through a survey. Okay, so bottom line, the benefits of focus groups are you get a lot of depth and complexity and potentially very practical input. But they do depend on the facilitator's skills, and it is a challenging. I mean, it's at the end of a focus group, I feel exhausted because it's just a huge mental effort to keep it going and to manage all those different dimensions. So qualitative data analysis, there's a whole methodological literature on doing qualitative data analysis. The standard way to do it is a thematic analysis where you're drawing out patterns. This is something that can be done more efficiently now with the use of generative AI tools like ChatGPT. I'm doing a workshop on that topic coming up sometime in the coming months. But it's an emerging field about how to make this a more efficient process, and it's getting easier. Traditionally, it's been pretty tough. There's also observation as a method. So in some cases, it can be helpful to see actually how people are engaging with an activity and maybe even to record it or connect up different kinds of data. So this is an example of an evaluation that I did where I did that, where I was using a mix of qualitative interviews and observation and qualitative surveys. Okay, so just wanted to highlight that survey data can be qualitative as well. So this is an example called a concept map, where you put the relevant concept that you're trying to measure, and you have people write or draw whatever comes to mind when they think of it. You repeat that before and after an activity, and you have some impact evaluation evidence. Quantitative evaluation is most often surveys. So the focus here is on proportion, numerical outcomes. Surveys are by far the most used method of evaluating public engagement, mainly because they're efficient. So it's a way to get your data efficiently. The main problem I see is poor survey design. Means that it's kind of with poor survey design, you get low quality results that are not actually good to use. So where you can draw on existing survey questions that have been developed through a kind of proper methodological process, and then you're kind of borrowing them, that can be helpful. But that's the major challenge, is the survey design level. And it's worth highlighting that survey data should be collected at the level of the individual. So if you're wanting to measure with families, for example, then you would be collecting data from each member of the family. You shouldn't just do one survey form for a whole family, because then the most powerful member of that family, their voice will take over the survey form. And you want to avoid any technical jargon at all when you're conducting a survey for public engagement. There are a range of different survey types available. As I'm sure you're aware of, we all complete surveys, mostly terrible surveys all the time. And I'll just show you an example of how this can be used for impact measurement. And that's this is just a simple example of a pre-post measure. So what comes to mind when you think of the brain? This is from an exhibition that was about brain research at the Oxford Natural History Museum. And essentially what comes to mind answers from before to after changed in the direction that was intended by this exhibition. So this is evidence that the exhibition is working as it's intended. So this is a straightforward way of collecting qualitative impact data. Quantitative impact evidence often is as simple as movement in a Likert type response. So the level of agreement with a statement shifting from before to after an intervention would be a straightforward example of impact assessment. This is just an example I like to show, which is from an evaluation I did at London Zoo. The annotated drawings here, where people are asked, in this case, they're asked to write or draw whatever comes to mind when they thought of their favorite wildlife habitat, and then put labels on it. So I show this example just to kind of highlight that survey data can take many different forms. You can use drawings, you can use concept maps. It doesn't have to be just a level of agreement scale all the time. You can take more creative approaches. So I've used this annotated drawing method in a variety of contexts. In this case, it was measuring learning from a training program about corals and other kinds of things. A program that was in the national park in Brazil, looking at representations of conservation actions. So a lot of different contexts. So all of these different methods feed into a bottom line of evidence-based public engagement. So you can draw on evaluation evidence in order to take a more strategic approach. That's the goal.